Eviction is when a landlord legally makes a tenant leave a rental property. There are different reasons a landlord can evict someone, usually split into two types. For cause, where the tenant did something wrong, or no cause where no fault is on the tenant. This video will give you an overview of how evictions work. It's important for tenants to know their rights. These include notice requirements. Landlords have to give tenants written notice to leave, otherwise known as notice to vacate. This allows time to fix any issues or look for a new place. Legal process. A landlord can't just throw out a tenant. They must follow a legal process, including getting a court order. The first action a landlord takes when starting an eviction is to issue a formal eviction notice, often called a notice to vacate. This explains to the tenant why the eviction process is being initiated. The notice also gives the tenant a chance to fix the issue, whether that means paying overdue rent or stopping disruptive behavior, depending on what the problem is. If the tenant doesn't correct the issue or decides to leave the property by the deadline stated in the notice, the next step for the landlord is to take legal action. This involves going to court to order the tenant to move out. Protection against retaliation and discrimination. Laws protect tenants from being evicted as a form of revenge or based on discrimination. In Louisiana, evictions are handled by different courts depending on the location of the property and the amount of rent involved. Different courts handle evictions, including justice of the peace courts, city, parish, or district courts. In Louisiana, legal reasons for eviction include non-payment of rent. When a tenant doesn't pay their rent on time, the landlord can't immediately evict them. Instead, the landlord must first give the tenant a 5-day notice. This notice is a written warning that tells the tenant they have 5 days to pay the overdue rent. If the tenant manages to pay within these 5 days, they can avoid eviction. However, if the tenant still hasn't paid the rent after this period, the landlord can legally begin the eviction process to remove the tenant from the property. Lease violations. When a tenant does something that goes against their rental agreement, such as keeping pets when they're not allowed or having more people living in the home than the lease permits, this is called a lease violation. In such cases, the landlord can evict the tenant immediately. Instead, the landlord must first give the tenant notice. This notice informs the tenant that they have violated the terms of their lease and gives them a chance to fix the issue. If the tenant corrects the situation, they can often stay. However, if they don't make the necessary changes within the time specified in the notice, the landlord can then legally proceed with eviction. End of lease. Landlords may decide not to renew a lease when it ends. When a rental lease reaches its end date, the landlord has the option to decide whether to renew the lease or let it expire without renewal. If the landlord chooses not to renew the lease, the tenant will need to move out by the end date specified in the lease agreement. This doesn't require any fault or violation on the part of the tenant. It's simply the landlord's decision not to continue renting to the tenant once the current lease is up. No lease or month-to-month. When tenants don't have a formal long-term lease but rent on a month-to-month basis, their rental agreement is more flexible for both the tenant and the landlord. In these cases, either the tenant or the landlord can decide to end the rental arrangement without giving a specific reason. However, the landlord must provide the tenant with proper notice before they must move out. Typically, this notice is required to be given at least 10 days in advance. Property damage. When a tenant causes significant damage to a rental property, this can lead to eviction. This usually begins with the landlord giving the tenant a notice that specifies the damage and the need for eviction. If the tenant doesn't repair the damage or the situation doesn't improve, the landlord can legally proceed to remove the tenant from the property. Illegal activity. If a tenant is involved in illegal activities, such as drug dealing, on the rental property, this can lead to eviction. Engaging in any crime on the premises is a serious violation of the rental agreement. The process typically starts with the landlord providing notice to the tenant that specifies the illegal behavior and the intention to evict. If the tenant does not stop the illegal activity immediately, the landlord can then legally proceed with eviction. Disturbing peace. If a tenant's actions are causing significant disruption to the peace of other tenants or neighbors, this can be a valid reason for eviction. Significant disruption of peace may be caused through loud parties, constant loud noise, or aggressive behavior. Evictions due to disturbing peace usually begin with a warning notice to the tenant, outlining their disruptive behavior and asking for it to stop. If the behavior continues despite the warning, the landlord has the right to proceed with eviction procedures. Both landlords and tenants need to be aware of the rules surrounding evictions. Remember, a landlord must go through the court process to evict a tenant. If tenants feel that their eviction isn't fair or justified, they may have legal grounds to challenge it. In such cases, tenants should find a lawyer who specializes in landlord-tenant law. A lawyer can offer advice, help understand the law, and provide strategies for defense against eviction. We hope this video helps you understand more about evictions in Louisiana. For further details, please check out the rest of our Evictions page on louisianalawhelp.org.